So feel free to unmute and take it away.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. I think we've got, we're spanning certainly a lot of time zones even amongst us panelists here. It's 7 a.m. for me, and it's I think around 9 p.m. for Dasapta, and we've got a few people in between. So we've got really quite the panel for us this morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever it may be. So first, let me welcome everyone to this session on open infrastructure. I'm Juan Pablo Alperin. I'm an assistant professor in the publishing program at Simon Fraser University, as well as an associate director with the Public Knowledge Project and the co-director of the Scholarly Communications Lab. And I guess for the next hour and a half, I'm also your host and the chair of this panel. I just want to say very briefly, just a couple of words about why we decided to have a panel on open infrastructure. Really, there was sort of two main reasons. The first, that it has become apparent in the last few years that the community has become very much interested in the concepts of community-owned, academy-owned, scholar-led, or simply open infrastructure. And these terms have been getting bandied about for the last few years, sometimes without too much deep thought or reflection. And so we wanted to make sure we wanted to open up a space in which these terms, the ideas and the concepts and their implications have. And so that's one of the things that we hope we accomplish today. But perhaps more profoundly, we hope that having a session on open infrastructure would reflect on the ways that achieving greater open access and open data for ourselves, in and of themselves rather, is not quite enough. This year, we've all been living through, is presenting us all with some incredible challenges. But as the saying goes, well, we're all in the same storm. We're not all in the same boat. And we continue to see the ways that countries increasingly try to address some of the issues of access through national solutions. But the challenges of infrastructure are not so easily contained. Countries cannot simply have their own infrastructures independent of everybody else. And in the same way that they can just pay for access to provide their own citizens access to the research. So we wanted to ask, what have we learned about both the openness and robustness of the digital infrastructure to support scholarly communication? What has worked well and where have the gaps become apparent? As we try to recover from the shock of this year, how can we engage with the existing challenges of sustaining investment in open tools, platforms, and standards that all of research relies upon? Or will we let the looming budget cuts that are coming, probably for many of us, pull us away from building infrastructure that's actually necessary for building rapid global exchange of research that will get us through this crisis and through other crises that will emerge in the future? I don't expect that the panelists are going to answer all of these questions, but I'm convinced that they're going to steer us in the right direction. And so I'm thrilled to introduce the group that will help guide this conversation today. First, we're going to hear from Kaitlin Thaney, whose career has centered around open infrastructure organizations in some way or another. She has been the endowment director for the Wikimedia Foundation, has directed the program portfolio for the Mozilla Foundation, and helped to build the Mozilla Science Lab. Was on the founding team of Digital Science, and way back in the day, I think around when we met, she was working with Creative Commons. She's currently the executive director of the Invest in Open Infrastructure organization, and is therefore, I think, ideally suited to helping us think strategically about questions surrounding open infrastructure. She's going to be followed by Dasapta Irawan, who comes from a very sort of a completely different perspective. Having received his PhD in the field of geology and hydrogeology, he first came to think about questions of openness through his work with open source tools that he used to analyze hydrochemistry data sets. However, he has since plunged himself into the world of open science, and a few years ago, along with some colleagues, started RINarxiv, a national level preprint service for Indonesia. Dasapta has both witnessed firsthand the successes of supporting open science with open infrastructure, as well as has now experienced some of the challenges that come along with it. And I know that we have a lot to learn from both his experience and his perspective. Next, we'll hear from Devika Madalli. Will sort of once again help us to shift the perspective about open infrastructure. And that's, she's going to help us think about it from the area of open data. Professor Madalli heads the Documentation Research and Training Center at the Indian Statistical Institute and has vast experience in information science teaching and research. She has been deeply involved in shaping conversations around open data as a member of the technical advisory of the Research Data Alliance, as a consultant for UNFAO and UNESCO, and as an internationally advisory board member for the Fair for Health EU project. As we think about open infrastructure, we thought it was important to bring on board someone with her international perspective on open data, so as to not limit ourselves to the world of journals and articles that so often the conversations about scholarly communication center upon. And last but certainly not least, we will have an opportunity to hear from Latin American perspective from my friend Arley Soto. Arley is a professional in information systems who has worked at the library system for Colombia's largest national university. And for over a decade now, it has been providing services for libraries and publishers in Latin America through the company that he co-founded, Biteca. As you'll undoubtedly hear from his presentation, Latin America relies heavily on open source software and open services, and he and his company have come to understand the value and the challenges, as well as the good community practices through the work that they've been doing, and through helping to provide high quality research services through open infrastructure and open source. Taken together, I think our panelists will sort of give us a tour of some of the main issues, the questions, the challenges, and importantly, I think the opportunities that open infrastructure present to all of us. Each speaker will have 15 minutes to present, after which time, if you are going over those 15 minutes, you're gonna be trying to see me gesturing at you from the little Zoom window in the corner. But if we all stick to our times, we should have time for about 20 minutes or a little bit more for questions at the very end. And so we'll group the questions from everyone, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end of all 4 presentations. I do ask for all of you listening that if you could please use the Q&A feature and not the chat window to ask questions. Thank you. I will hold my microphone so it doesn't keep banging on my shirt. So yeah, please do use the chat for conversations if there's anything that you want to communicate to the panelists. But right underneath or next to where the chat button is at the bottom of your screen, there's also a Q&A button. It makes it a lot easier if we can group all of the questions into one place. It'll also make it easier for us to copy those questions into the Slack group afterwards so that we have a record of those questions that were asked. I will be drawing on questions that are asked in that section there. And so please make sure you use that feature. I also invite you to engage with one another throughout the panel, both in the chat window, for that's really a good use of the chat, but also on Twitter at the hashtag OASPA 2020. And also on the channel that we've set up specifically for this session on Slack. And that would be a good place to sort of start the conversation on open infrastructure with the other panelists, as well as with all of the participants that are in the group. I know all of our panelists have joined that Slack group, and I'm sure that they would be happy to engage with you there, perhaps after they finished their portion of the presentation. So without further ado, and enough from me, let me turn it over to Kaitlin.
Thanks, Juan. Let me share my screen. Here we go. There you go. So huge thanks, and Juan, feel free to flag me down if for some reason the slides are not showing up. I think we should be good. So Juan asked me to join you all to help set some of the critical questions and issues for our discussion, and also share some of the learnings since that we have surfaced over the last few months for Invest in Open Infrastructure. And so this is really intended to help not only give you a little bit of a sense as to our perspective coming into this space, but also some of the things that we're hearing, and we're working with other members of not only the scholarly ecosystem in terms of publishers and other supporting organizations, but also institutions and funders as well. The broad layout here, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of those core issues that Juan had outlined when it comes to some of the challenges around infrastructure and how we define that, as well as where some of those tension points and points of conflict are starting to emerge, where we are excited to discuss a few paths forward to navigate that complexity. So just quickly, a little bit about Invest in Open Infrastructure. IOI was created out of an event back in probably late summer 2018, the Joint Roadmap of Open Science Tools, with this broad aim to help foster a shared, interoperable, and community-driven network of open infrastructure to advance scholarly research. In practice, our aim is to help improve the funding and resourcing for the open technology and systems that research relies on. When we talk about some of the broad history of IOI, I think it's important to point out not only that initial founding in 2018 at that workshop, really coming out of frustration and need from practitioners at that in-person workshop, but then also emerging as a coalition of infrastructure providers, advocacy organizations, individuals based in institutions that were moving this work forward, others that were looking at different interventions to help create a more sustainable ecosystem for open infrastructure, and also help define what all fit within those parameters. In 2019, there was some initial starter funding for IOI that from Schmidt Futures and the Sloan Foundation. And worth noting that, you know, I joined this past March right in the midst of the pandemic, or right at the outset of that, at least in North America. One of the key things I think that was really interesting coming out of that JROST meeting was really looking at the plethora of options that already existed, and trying to figure out how best to navigate what, you know, many define as the infrastructure or the tool layer that underpins research and scholarship. Many of you will be familiar with many of the logos that are here, and really this is just a snapshot of some of the tools that we know are in practice or relied on. But also digging into what are the various levels of investment from institutions, as well as what are the infrastructure, you know, providers, how are they approaching sustainability, interoperability, workflow management, etc. This piece of work here, funded by the Alfred P. Mallon Foundation, the work here came out of 3 of our steering committee members, David Lewis, formerly of IUPUI, who is also known for the 2.5% commitment, Catherine Skinner from the Educopia Institute, and Mike Roy from Middlebury, to start to see, you know, what a census for open infrastructure projects in the scholarly communication space looked like, as well as digging into what, you know, current investments and levels of support existed for this work. This really helped in that time period between, you know, the August, September timeframe 2018 to when I joined in March, to help really move forward and better understand some of the things in the landscape that were, you know, really starting to evolve towards this conversation around open infrastructure, ways in which we can better sustain it, and what it meant for these pieces to fit together. And then the crises happened. I know we've had a number of presentations for OASPA so far, not just focused on, you know, what this current moment in time, given the pandemic, the global health crisis, and the economic crisis, how that has helped shift and in many cases forced a conversation around efficiency, around increased levels of service and access, shifts to digital formats, some of the other elements there that have changed on the systems wide in terms of moving this conversation forward beyond our usual suspect groups. But also, I know from yesterday, Alexia Hudson Ward mentioned the very real social justice crisis that we're facing as well. And so just recognizing that we had a really fascinating moment in time where these conversations are bringing in perspectives and taking on different forms of urgency that I think we need to be mindful of, especially as we start looking at the broader context in which our decisions lie. Out of that, really, for IOI coming, you know, and getting started this past March, we bake in a few key assumptions. One being that openness is going to be more radically accepted, even demanded, than ever post-crisis. We're already seeing some of this in terms of recognizing that value and making that case in ways that, again, have accelerated some of the work that many of us have been doing for 15, 20, and 20 plus years. Also, that some key infrastructure pieces are at risk of going out of business or consolidating by the end of the year. The economic volatility and the shifts in the funding landscape are real. And I think understanding that this is forcing institutions and forcing an increased level of scrutiny as to what we invest our time and also our money into from various pockets of the ecosystem, and look at different ways in which we can help support to ensure that our systems are interoperable to the extent that's helpful, and that we're also thinking about how we can get content in or out of systems, what redundancy looks like, and more broadly, resilience. I also wanted to just point out that, you know, one of the founding elements for IOI really came out of this frustration of, you know, feeling like there was some forced competition in the open, nonprofit, community-owned space based on scarcity of resources. I'm a firm believer that it's easier to say what's not enough than to identify what's needed to fix the system. Our approach really helps to try to address that and to make more accessible some of the evidence base so that we can elevate that conversation. We do that in a few ways. We conduct research to increase our understanding of the landscape, and I'll talk through some of the work that we're currently doing. We craft resources to help others assess, build, and make investment decisions to better support this landscape. And then we also work with stakeholders to pilot solutions and coordinate efforts to put this into action. Back in March and April of this past year, as we were realizing that the broader framework for our work for open infrastructure was really taking on much more urgency and immediacy, given the volatility and the uncertainty that we were seeing, you know, especially in North America and in the US in terms of higher ed grappling with some of these issues, where there was an increased need for access to research and data and access to resources, as well as kind of paired with these budget cuts and fragility in the system. We worked with a number of institutional leaders, specifically those that were from libraries and also touching various forms of scholarship, to stand up an effort to say, okay, if we were to all work together and recognize at the current moment in time, we didn't want to lock in, you know, the current way of thinking, but more so explore where there might be some shared areas for collective action, and outline what those risks and do that scenario planning together. What would that look like? And again, a lot of this was really to look at, you know, hedging against infrastructure collapse, which I had outlined a little bit earlier in this presentation. That work evolved from 16 initial partners in the end of June to now 98 participants in 18 countries and 5 continents around the world. Over the course of the month of July and early August, I conducted 54 interviews with these various groups to better understand where they were, and also what the, you know, where their initial thinking was in terms of what they were perceiving as risks, friction points, areas that they needed immediate action, and what their threshold for change was. As you'll see here, this was a completely self-selected bunch. And so we do see some of the usual, you know, kind of imbalances when it comes to more representing on the North American side than in other areas of the world. But just to note that, you know, that this effort grew quite significantly, and we're currently working on ensuring that these resources are kind of painted in the right context, but also shared out more broadly. And one of the key things that we've seen in our work so far over the past 6 months is really in terms of when we talk about defining open infrastructure, what do various individuals mean when they say that? And what is their base level understanding? You know, I'm a firm believer, and so in the work for IOI, in meeting people where they are. And so we take a very broad brushstroke to this of, you know, looking at the tools, the services, and the systems that underpin research and scholarship. But recognizing that, you know, when we talk about open infrastructure, in many cases, we need to kind of go back to making sure that we have alignment as to what counts when we talk about open infrastructure as a broad issue. And you'll hear some perspectives from our co-panelists as to what that looks like in their context as well. Some of the top line considerations about, you know, what counts as open, what are the degrees of openness, what's critical, what's necessary, who does it serve? How are we making decisions? You know, are we employing a values-based framework? Are there principles which guide our decisions, institutional missions, even indigenous knowledge and other structures that help drive how we apply these principles in practice? How do we prioritize based on investment decisions, staffing decisions? What do we choose to support first in terms of foundational infrastructure and maintenance versus new innovation that might help evolve the space? And what does it mean to reconcile those tensions and conflict depending on whether we're looking at local constructs or more of a coalition or a global community? Points of tension that we're currently hearing through this work, and we're a few months in, focusing on how to balance the demand and also resourcing, the increased need for services versus the budget cuts. What does it mean to navigate that? The timeliness, the immediacy of some of the decisions in terms of rolling out, say, a service to help meet a critical need in the short term for discipline, institution-wide or across a larger group. How do we balance that with the community-driven development of a tool that might be longer lasting, but might take a little bit longer in terms of the development side? How do we prioritize local benefit versus general impact? When institutional leaders are looking at spending their resources on something unique for their campus, how does that balance out in the decision making versus helping to achieve broader public good? And again, this foundational infrastructure, what do we choose to maintain versus how do we also provide space for newer efforts that might be still developing but be necessary and needed for the space? And then lastly, especially given some of the hiring freezes, furloughs, staffing reallocation that we're looking at in certain areas, some hit differently than others. I know particularly in the US context, this has been a place where the budget cuts have hit quite significantly. Given the investment of in-kind resources for open technology projects, how does that impact governance, project maintenance, and possibly further shift development support to third-party vendors that might, again, put a different level of consideration and prioritization into the mix? Quickly, I wanted to talk through just a few key issues here. So when we talk about usage, for a researcher starting their PhD today, which I know in the UK is much faster than in the US, but say in the US being 5 to 7 years, the workflow tools that they're starting with aren't necessarily guaranteed to still be around when they finish their degree. There are issues here that I know a number of other speakers have touched on in terms of discoverability, cost, access, interoperability, as well as data ownership, and looking at what those trade-offs are for some of the decisions we make about open infrastructure, what we choose to participate in, and what we choose to offer up so that we can have broader efficiency or maybe even customer service for some of the tools we're talking about, especially as we see commercial entities in this space, buy up infrastructure for data and using that as a competitive advantage. On the resourcing side, we are also facing more tool options than we have funding to sustain it. I do want to note here that I frame it as a perception of resource scarcity, because I do believe that there are more effective ways of directing resources, but it still remains quite challenging to start to move this through. Funding is often time limited, and it's easier to support new things, not sustain or maintain. On the development side, again, decisions often favor local development and customization. Where is that at odds with some of the communal benefit? And where can we start to build out some of that support? And then lastly, on the equity and access side, wanting to make sure that we are addressing some of the systemic inequities that not only exist in terms of open technology, but also in higher ed and institutions and research, and then also in terms of investment, which is the area that we inhabit. Who does that preclude from being part of the conversation and using these resources, and what voices are missing? In terms of paths forward, looking at where there might be means of navigating this complex space. On the near term, where can we work within our existing technology investments and systems to better interoperate, integrate, and connect? Medium term, are there models and frameworks that we can learn from as well as leverage? And I know we've got a couple of examples you'll be hearing from right after this, but also thinking of national models and also consortia. And then longer term, what does it look like to transform our support models and systems? We're working on all these various areas, and I'd invite you all to participate. You can contact me here, and I look forward to the future discussion for this panel. Thanks, Juan. That's it.
That's perfect. And that's really a great sort of framing, because you're touching on so many of the sort of the big questions and big issues around open infrastructure. And I think that's sort of the perfect way to sort of then delve into some of the specific cases and to start talking about some of the individual situations. And so with that, let me turn it over to Dasapta, who will talk to us about the experiences that he's been having in Indonesia. So Dasapta, if you want to take over.
Thank you, Juan. Let me share my screen. Okay, and then, okay. So, thank you, everyone. It's close to 9:30 p.m. now here in Indonesia. Thank you to all for coming to the session. This is my title of the talk. I cannot think of any walls except for the Berlin Wall, because it really makes digital divides between people now in academic and research ecosystem, especially in Indonesia. So my story here will be based on my experience and my observations from Indonesia point of view. My talk here is supported by my colleague, Juan Abraham, which comes from the Faculty of Humanities of Bina Nusantara University. Okay, so here he is, Juan. And this slide is part of the following works which I work with collaboratively with people from Indonesia and also from several countries. And you can click the link, and for instance, the number one is, we just published this maybe 3 or 4 days ago, and in Indonesian language. And this is the English version. You'd be surprised how Google Translate have evolved throughout the years. So, I merely changed words into the original, from the original version. I just copy paste the Indonesian version to the Google Translate, and then the English version is from my point of view, is very good. And then we also have this open access debates in Indonesia. It's going to be published in Development and Change Journal. This is the preprint, you can click it. And then also with my colleague from France, Olivier Poré, talking about the open access in geochemistry, which is, that is my core field of science that I work on daily. So just to remind us all, in June 2020, I was invited to join the INASP discussion. Most of the participants come from the African continent, and I draw this picture to summarize the situation there. So it's there will be 1, 2, 3, 4. So there are 4 challenges that faced by the African researchers. One is access. 2, the second is channels for collaboration. The third is capacity and incentive. And the fourth is related to politics and power. So the core challenge is kind of similar to what we have here in Southeast Asia, but of course we have a relative rank between countries due to the different economy background, but more or less the main challenges are the same. So this is what happens in Indonesia. We have some examples of government strategies to support open access. One is by releasing National System for Science and Technology Law, which is in one of the clause, it mandates open access for all research funded by the government. So the word open access now is explicitly mentioned in our law. And then we also, in technical level, we also have rujukan. Rujukan is Rumah Jurnal Keilmuan. In English, I can translate home for academic journal. Right? It centralized OJS server hosted by the Indonesia Institute of Science. It's a government institution. They host maybe around close to, I don't get the exact number, but I think it's close to 50 journals have been hosted by the Rujukan. They work closely with the Public Knowledge Project using the OJS 3. And then we also have National Scientific Repository or Repository Ilmiah Nasional. It's hosted also by the Indonesia Institute of Science in relation with the law described in point number 1. So we have the law, and then we have the repository to store data, yeah, a National Scientific Repository, and we also have centralized OJS server. Yeah, of course, every institution, every university who has journal, who manage to publish a journal, has their own server. I think Indonesia is one of the highest users for OJS, but here the government also support journals who haven't go online by make a own centralized server, national level. And we also have an kind of association, informal association of journal manager here. That is called Relawan Journal Indonesia. I think the member is close to 300 journals. This association holds continuous activity based on donation from the members and the participants to host the good practices to manage journal and how to operate, install the journal operating system. For instance, here we use OJS mostly. And we also have the RINarxiv. This is a new brand. The old one is InArchive, hosted by the OSF. And then starting 21st of May, 2020, this year, we moved the brand to Indonesia. So the server is now hosted by Indonesian institution, Indonesia Science Institute. Thank you for LIPI to support us. And then we also have small communities in several universities. One of them is Sains Terbuka Universitas Airlangga. It's from Surabaya, East Java province. They also have an active movement to support open science here. And then talking about the academic journals, we have our own indexing service. It's operated by the government, the Ministry of Research and Education. The name is Garuda. Garuda is one of the species of bird, but it's also the acronym of this, the gate to the digital reference in English. You can see the numbers here, it's quite high. And then we also have another indexing service, our own, developed by the National Library, Perpusnas here. It's also hosts data from close to 2,000 institutions. So this one's index repositories, institutional repository, and then the left one, Garuda, index academic journals. So it's quite high numbers. It's just the number of open access repositories registered to the Open DOR. So based on those numbers, I think the research ecosystem in Indonesia is very vibrant and very active, but we also have challenges, and the strongest challenges is this wall, the wall of prestige. I sent out these two diagrams, this one and this one, to the UNESCO when they held a consultation on open science. So the point is, my point is, even if we overcome the challenges, we can overcome the challenges, the technology, the infrastructure, the skills, and also the funding. Yeah, of course, our money in Indonesia is not as high as other countries, especially in Europe and America continent, but we have enough fund to operate the infrastructures that I have said earlier, right? But the problem is the life of the academic here is kind of divided into two. Yeah? I made another diagram here in left hand side. Whether he wants to go to support open access in Indonesia, to go the right way, and also at the same time he also have to think about the prestige of him or herself, and the prestige of the university, and also the at national level, because here we use world-class university ranking as the base of our vision and mission, and also funding proportion every year is based on the criteria and how we can get into the world-class university, like THES or QS or Shanghai Jiatong world-class university rank. So we always have the left way, which is mostly dominates by commercial publisher. We have to admit that. So if we choose the right way, we can manage it, right? We have the journal, we have the research fund, because most of the research fund here come from the government. But if we only take the right way, and then the left way is kind of left behind. So our rank will go ground zero maybe. So in the perception of our minister is the performance is defined to go lower. So all the decision will be based on the world-class ranking. How we did last year in the world-class university ranking. And we also have this kind of superiority where a junior researcher will be dictated by the senior researcher about how to define success, how to define quality, how to define prestige. So I made this diagram here. So the perception of prestige is kind of passed down from the senior lecturer or researcher to the junior researcher. So they themselves built the wall, right? So we built the wall ourselves, and then we complain we complain that it's going to be wrong because there's this wall, but we ourselves built the wall, and by building the wall, we also can get high enough, right? So if we have a balloon, the balloon is supposed to be flying up there, and instead of flying high, the balloon is just floating on top of a car. So it's not going to be maximum, right? It's because we have this burden here in Indonesia. So all of these red bags is we measure the success of researcher personally, and also the lab, the laboratory, the university, based on these loads, right? And then the remarks is kind of echoing the talk by Seymour earlier today, and also by Pierre Monnier, I think, yeah, about scaling small, yeah. So scaling small, in my mind, in our mind, is kind of getting all we need within our reach. We set our goal, we set our activity based on what we have. Yeah? In this case is open infrastructure, open source software, and try to disseminate as wide as we can. So scaling small is not about the dissemination, but about the internal process to run the academic ecosystem. So by building a scaling small infrastructure, I found this word is very interesting. We can seek to build resilience within scholarly publishing. So this is my closing slide. So open science is just science done right. It's from Melanie Iming, and also from my friend John Tennant, who is passed away in April this year, to remember him by. Thank you, Juan. That's all from me.
That's brilliant, and I love well, both the content and the form of your presentation. I think starting to really helping us to think about some of these questions. I think, and we're gonna hopefully we'll get in a chance into a discussion now. Both you and Kaitlin have started to touch upon some of the local and global dimensions and the interplay between them, and sometimes the challenges and barriers that are sort of self-imposed, and sometimes they're structurally imposed. And so just lots of good things for us to start thinking about, and I'm starting to see some questions starting to queue up in the Q&A section, so we'll get to them soon. Let me turn it over to Devika. If you would like to turn on your screen share and get that going. I think, I'm not sure if you will also be sharing your video. I think you had mentioned that perhaps for bandwidth reasons you might not, but either way it'd be nice to get your slides, and I'll turn it over to you to start presenting.
Thank you, Juan. I'm just trying to get my slides on here.
Looks good.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I would like to start by thanking the organizers and Juan for this session, bringing together this panel on an important topic of open infrastructures. My own presentation is not a presentation, but a collection of my thoughts, what I think are pertinent to be addressed at such a panel that we are sitting at today with the participation like we have today. So I'll just be giving some pointers in a very short presentation about what open infrastructure, as I envisage it, and as I have participated in various initiatives across the world, mean or intend to mean. So with that, I generally call it as an open mantra that is required. We coined this way back with my colleague. The open mantra we coined in about 2007. But again, the mantra is still yet to take place. So the principle of openness, of course, you might have heard it many times. Open by default and closed as necessary has come to be an acceptable definition or a principle. But I would like to call the attention of us to say that it must be open by default and closed as strictly necessary, because I am concernedly watching people taking a sort of refuge under the word as necessary. So as necessary is being stretched and used in many different ways. And I think it's time to refine that a bit and say that people have to establish why something needs to be closed, indeed, if it is closed. So coming to the infrastructure itself, the open infrastructure that is the main topic of this panel. My own concern has been that there has been overemphasis on two things of the open infrastructure. One is overwhelmingly the physical infrastructure, all the physical hardware components and things like that. The other one, not misplaced, but there is a whole lot of emphasis on the content itself, which seems very natural. But when we take it in the context of the entire gamut, in the entire stack that should go into open infrastructure, I feel these two things have far got a lot of attention when compared to others. So I would like to bring the attention of people here to what it should actually be. Start with policies, something like encompassing care and fair, with covering legalities, covering all communities, things like that. Then the physical infrastructure and network and whatever that is. Embedded open standards. Then comes the content, and of course the driving force would be the manpower, the people that's required. So I would like to draw attention of our scientific community to this whole stack and not overemphasize on one or the other of these. So policies, like I mentioned, my colleague and I started talking about the open mantra, which we were using basically those days for the open digital repositories in advocating the use of open source software with embedded open standards to create open access information or content on the way to realize open science, or today what we call as open research commons. So why I went back in time to again mention this was because we said this as early as in 2000, early 2000, still 2007, that open source software, OSS by itself is exciting, and people sort of accept it, people start using it. But often enough, after opening a few open doors, we come across one closed door, which we have not noticed at the outset, and that closed door could be a proprietary standard. So that's why exactly what the emphasis we wanted to give by open mantra, saying that be very, very careful in choosing the OSS that you choose, or the platform that you choose, or the service provider that you choose who claims to be open, open, open. But be very careful in your evaluation that it is embedded with open standards, which will not be a hurdle tomorrow for us on our journey towards the open science commons or open research commons. Of course, the policies today have to be compliant with the FAIR, and then we have progressed from FAIR also to include CARE, where we take care of communities around the world. And especially this is more pertinent from where I come from, the Global South, where the benefits have to be seen more as a collective benefit. And if there has to be control, who controls it, if there has to be responsibilities, on who we lay the responsibilities on, responsibilities, how we track the responsibilities, and how we manage the ethical way of sharing and caring for data. So the policy today is required to encompass the whole gamut from fair to care. And then comes, actually I mentioned this already, the technology stack and network, open source of course, without doubt, but as I already emphasized, with embedded open standards and with open license, which is explicitly mentioned. This is another point that I worry about usually, that something is available on GitHub or somewhere and people are enthusiastic to use it, but in the end they realize there is some fine print there, which is again a closed door. So make sure that there is something explicitly mentioned. We have several tools like we have in the CC, the Creative Commons, and we just have to, as the scientific community, spread the word to give importance to this licensing part of it. And again, to stress on what I mean by open standards is, though I said it in a breeze in just 1 second, but it is much more than just technology. The open standards will be, of course, followed for technology, for the network components, but also for something like metadata. We are choosing what is a standard or what is a de facto used by a certain community or countries or continents, whatever that regional things that is used in order to make everything open. And of course, encoding, of course, because I do come from India, there's a lot of multilingual challenges that we face here. So what kind of character encoding or other encoding that we are using. So make sure that the openness flows across this stack. Now coming to the content, as I already said, there is a lot of discussion about what content should go open, whether this content is open or not. There's a lot of discussion, but this is one component in the whole stack, and albeit the most important one, because it is about the content, the opening up of the content that you are talking about. So we talk about governmental and institutional content. We talk about the types of content, like of the data, like it could be research, it could be, though there is again a lot emphasis about research data commons and things like that, but there are other things like governance data, there is citizen services, because a lot of emphasis on things like smart services, and these are completely data driven, and we have to be very conscious of this, that these are also imminent data sets that we will be looking at when we talk about open content. Of course, there's this whole discussion about sensitive data, and like I already said, that we have to refine the definition of openness around what is strictly required. I do not disrespect that people have privacy issues, and they need to, and providers need to protect the privacy of people. Hence, it is very important to recognize the sensitive data, the part of data that is sensitive, and protect the stakeholders whose interests may be compromised otherwise. I already mentioned in the content, we take care of communities. When we say communities across the world, and they are not essentially English speaking or English understanding communities. There would be multilingual issues, and the stack, the open stack that we talk about, has to cater to the multilingual issues also. Last but not the least, I would like to touch upon capacities. At least in India, I have not seen an advertisement for open access librarian or open access data provider or something. It is another added duty to somebody who's already doing something, or somebody who is an enthusiast and just learns how to of OA, and he learns one part of it because he's interested in it, and it's not as though it's a holistic learning. It is something that raises out of his occupation, out of his day-to-day work. That is a bit of a concern for me, being an open access advocate for like what now, 1.5 decades, 2 decades now. We are still not having a focus on curricula and formal education for OA. I do not know if there is a study on this, how much formal education has been there on open access as part of maybe information literacy courses, or as part of say library and information science courses, or even a part of data stewardship courses. I really do not know, and it would be interesting to learn about such initiatives, or to undertake something like a study on how much formal education is out there. And as I said, we are expecting people to normally learn on their jobs about what this OA is all about, what it encompasses, and what the person, he or she, needs to learn to cope up with what is OA. So that brings us to the continuous education aspect of the capacity building or capacity enhancement. And of course, nowadays, people are overburdened with whatever they are doing. Everybody has their challenges in their professions, and just trying to meet the deadlines. So the order of the day is more towards micro learning rather than some modules that somebody thought was a good pedagogical way of delivery of content. That's not going to work. The traditional model, we have to break it down to some units which could be assimilated at ease of our end users or learning stakeholders. Whoever wants to learn should be able to access, first of all, in a way that they would like to, in a way that it is easily digestible. And of course, capacity enhancement only would be meaningful with meaningful engagement with the stakeholders. Even doing like something like a needs assessment, addressing why of OA, how of OA, with sitting down with the stakeholders is very, very important, which normally we think that we know it all. We are just doling out some open access content. So that model has to change. It has to be more sensitive to the stakeholders and their own their needs. That's what I wanted to make. So as I said, I had a very short presentation just to give some pointers to the discussion that will come after the talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Devika. I think you are sort of pointing us in a lot of directions for the conversations. In particular, I know that we're going to want to sort of touch upon some of the questions around the individual and the collective benefits and some of the roles of infrastructure. It's definitely one area that I'm going to want to dig into a little bit with the discussion that we'll have following. Let me turn it over to Arley, and we'll go to another part of the world, to Latin America, to hear about the situation there. Take it away, Arley.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Thank you for the invitation. Just I would like to check if you see my screen now.
Yes, we do.
Okay, excellent. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Juan, again. I'm so happy to share with you some reflections about open infrastructure for scholarly communications in Latin America. So I have divided my presentation in two parts. I have called the first one, We Are Latinos. And the second, We Speak Spanish. And when I say we are Latinos, I'm referring to specifically to all journals published in Latin America, including Brazil. And when I say we speak Spanish, I'm including Spain. And also, I realized that there is a country in Africa where Spanish is one of their official languages. So yeah, it was interesting. I didn't know that until I came across this in Wikipedia. And there are some people speaking Spanish also in Indonesia and a lot of in the United States. Well, we are Latinos. And talking about journals, according to Latindex, there have been more than 20,000 journals published in Latin America, around 1,300 in Cielo. And most of them have been always open. In the past, journals from universities in Latin America practiced something that we call canje. I'm talking about like 20 years ago or more, 30 years ago. The canje means journal exchange and consists in giving a printed journal to another institution and receiving one in return. That was a practice doing by all universities. When they printed the journal, a few copies were sold in bookstores and others sent to a few subscribers, but most of the copies were distributed to other institutions nationwide or international with this journal exchange. In this way, libraries at universities were able to increase their collections. Then, when the internet was massive and local journals started to publish scanned copies in PDF online, the journal exchange stopped, but the PDFs were published online for free without expecting anything in return. So our journals have been freely available on the web even before open access movement, even before Creative Commons, even before Budapest Declaration. This is why open access is not a novelty for us, as we have been open by default. So we don't have a transition between closed access to open access. What we are still living is a transition between printing and online only. 20 years ago, nobody used OGS in Latin America because most journals were printed. So Cielo and RINarxiv were extraordinary initiatives for making this science accessible and visible on the web. A huge innovation by that time was the HTML files required by Cielo to be in their portal. However, the things have changed a lot. Most of our journals are online and use OGS to publish content. By doing this, journals have their content highly visible on the web. And in my opinion, the role of aggregators is less important. I think for this reason, Cielo is thinking ahead and they are providing innovative services, a lot of them. But just an example, they are doing digital preservation with clocks, and they are also providing a preprint server in partnership with PKP. In the case of RINarxiv, for example, they are supporting the initiative Amelica, a community building project. We don't know the future yet, but I could anticipate that aggregators need to think if they are able to compete with services like Google or Google Scholar, described yesterday. Cielo and RINarxiv are important infrastructure for Latin America community, but what other initiatives do our journals rely on? Now, I will start with the free XML JATS markup for Microsoft Word, developed by Cielo and used by all of journals that are already in Cielo because it's the tool that journals use to mark up the articles. The add-in is free. It has been free always, but all the journals need Windows and Microsoft Office license for using it. So it's not entirely open. I would say that the best example of open infrastructure is, at least for Latin America, is Open Journal Systems. Most of our journals are using it. So thanks, PKP. However, as others have said, open infrastructure is not only open source software. Here are some examples of other projects that our journals rely on, like public identifiers, community projects, guidelines, long-term preservation services, and others. And who is finding all the work done by journals in Latin America? Well, the answer is publishers. But who is the publisher in Latin America? We don't have commercial publishers. And I think we don't need them. The main publishers in Latin America are universities, professional societies, scientific societies, a lot of them biomedical journals, and also research centers. These institutions are paying the bills. But who is providing the infrastructure? I mean, where is the manpower that Devika told? Big universities and institutions have their own IT departments, and they're providing this infrastructure. But other institutions that cannot afford an IT department are hiring temporary independent IT professionals or contracting providers like us. But what happens if an institution is running out of budget? How can a journal keep working if institutions do not allocate long-term budgets for them? So that's a question that I would like to highlight. So what service providers are doing? Well, service providers like us are providing hosting, technical support, advice, training, and other publishing services. And the question is, what service providers are doing for supporting open infrastructure? Just an example. In our company, we are paying like a small amount of money, like $2,000, something like that, to PKP since 2015, because we are bronze sponsor. Cielo is a developing partner with PKP since so many years. But who else is supporting PKP in Latin America? There are people and companies that are getting financial benefits from OGS, but I can't see their contribution to the community. Not all contributions are money, but we think we need to give something and not only to get. I think service providers should contribute more to the community. So the question is, what values a service provider should have? The first of all, and more important to me, is ethics. It's not a secret, the corruption that has affected Latin America for years. So we don't need corruption in the publishing business. We want to keep it clean. We want companies that compete with price and quality and the principles that fair and care. I think we need a code of practice for service providers. It has been cases where institutions working with commercial publishers lost some kind of control of their content or their image. For example, if an institution hire Elsevier to run the journal, probably the audience will say, oh, this journal is from Elsevier. But in fact, the journal is from the society or the institution, and it could be a wrong message to the audience. Well, as I said, I think we need a code of practice for service providers. The second part of my presentation is that we speak Spanish. And we publish in Spanish, but we are happy to translate title, abstracts, and keywords in other languages, mainly English and Portuguese, but not only. Open journal systems and open monograph preps developed by PKP are very good examples of multilingualism. OGS, if I'm not wrong, has been translated in more than 40 languages and growing. And there is like an infrastructure for adding more languages by the community. So it is a very good example. And I was really happy when I realized that there was a workshop about multilingualism on a Monday, and also a poster this early morning. I completely support them, and I also sign up the Helsinki Declaration of Multilingualism. However, governments like Colombia are putting pressure to publish in English because impact factor and H index. I would guess, I don't know. I think the reason behind is that the government is receiving advice from private companies or consultants that support the Elsevier model and traditional indicators like impact factor. It seems that our country has a fear of building our own indicators, and the easiest way is just to copy the norm model, which is a shame. We are suffering the same problems that Dasapta described before. Anyway, getting back to multilingualism, let me show you two examples of Colombian journals. This is example one. The journal published the full text in Spanish, but the metadata has been registered in OGS, in Spanish, English, and Portuguese. And this practice is being done by a lot of journals using OGS. This is another example. This journal published original work about biomedicine in Spanish, but the metadata is in Spanish and English and is widely available. For instance, in Cielo and PubMed Central. So we have identified a few multi-language challenges. For example, we think the interfaces of open infrastructure should be multi-language. Usually they are only in English. It happens, just to put a simple example, with the name of our institution, we need to be recognized by our real name, not a translation one. Just put it very simple. We are Colombia with O, not Colombia. So I ask myself, can the names be displayed in the original language and not in English by default? Translation are okay, but it is very important to be recognized by the original name. I think so. And I think Devika pointed out something very important about character encoding to, in order to support that. Another question, how far we are providing metadata schema for multi-language capabilities? Yeah, is the open infrastructure thinking about this? And the last one that I don't know how it works. Is the metadata in other languages is being indexed by crawlers like Google, Bing, Yahoo, Google Scholar, or only the full text is being indexed? Should we keep adding metadata in other languages in our OGS? Are the machines and crawlers reading that metadata? Just a question that I have. Finally, I have pointed out some open infrastructure challenges, in my opinion. The first of all is sustainability. And in our case, we have suffering budget cuts in institutions as well. And how could we reduce production costs for journals to make it sustainable in the long term? What about workflow optimization? For example, most of journals are using OGS, but mainly for content publishing. Not all of them are using the workflow with OGS. And what about the XML? Usually, journals are doing XML at last. Should we do it first? What are their implications? I have identified some redundancy of work. For example, some journals have more than 2 sites with the same content, OGS, Redalic, Cielo, WordPress, and they are like putting effort to have the content in all these platforms. But at the end, they are all very similar, almost the same. Should we use like a protocol like the OEAI instead? What about open references? Some journals are not recording references on Crossref, or they are not online, or they are not open. And what about the new indicators for specific subjects? I think journals need them. For example, humanities and journals in social sciences need like a better way to have indicators for them. Yeah, so we are Latinos and we speak Spanish. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Perfect. That was great, Arley. A nice sort of tour through some of the realities, and actually, I've also already starting to point at some of the similarities with and of the experiences and realities being faced by what situations described by both Dasapta and by Devika. Can I ask you to stop sharing your screen, and then can I just ask all of the panelists to, if you can, turn your video back on, so that folks can put themselves, if they want, into gallery view, and we can just have a little bit of a discussion in the 15 or so minutes that we've got left. There's lots to discuss, and there's actually a lot of great questions already being asked and answered in the Q&A. So first, I just encourage you all to start sort of flipping through those, or at least just in the background, there's a lot of answered questions. And there's still a few that we haven't quite gotten to, but let me start by what I'm sort of been grabbing some of the themes of those questions. And so let me ask my own question that's been inspired by what I was reading there. There's a couple of different ones that I want to touch on in terms of themes. The first one is this question around how do you, and this is a question, I'll just leave it open for anyone that wants to jump in. There was some explicit and some implicit references to the difference between the collective benefits that are achieved by infrastructure and how infrastructure is itself a project that really needs to be taken on as a collective. And there's some challenges and opportunities that I think were discussed by a few of you. So let me just ask it as a question. How do you see the differences and challenges around open access or open data in comparison to the difference in challenges around open infrastructure? In which ways do you conceive that the collective versus individual benefits that are achieved by each?
I'll just make an initial. Oh, go ahead, Devika. Devika, go ahead.
You go ahead, Kaitlin.
Just a one quick point I wanted to note on that. I think looking at it in terms of how people's ownership or sense of ownership around some of these issues, especially considering, say, open access and funds or policies that might supersede, say, an institution's or a specific discipline's decisions about open access, thinking funder mandates, disciplinary practices, norms that might also be there that help, drive adoption, versus in some cases what we're seeing with institutions that have invested a lot of time and resources in specific open infrastructure projects, a desire to have something that's really highly customized for their specific institution, which starts to have different repercussions in terms of how resources are allocated, where their faculty and students and researchers might be driven to deposit resources, what tools they might be supplied with, etc. So it's interesting in terms of what are the overarching pressures, and I think that some of the discussions around open access and open data as a means of underpinning scholarship writ large help move things forward in different ways than some of the actual infrastructure that's implemented in these contexts and where those kind of values and practicality diverge.
Devika, you wanted to jump in as well?
I quite agree with Kaitlin, and just to underline what she said, the examples of the biggest infrastructures that were brought in the world, we know, I don't want to name them, they came with the best intentions, but did not live up to whatever expectations of the scientific community was there, because somehow they were excluding one community or the other, or the interests of somebody or the other, not intentionally, but it so happened. So there are lessons to be learned from these big initiatives that opened up a shared infrastructure. And again, the next point I would try to make is my presentation itself. There had been an overemphasis about physical elements of an infrastructure. And I think that is where the inclusiveness failed. We have to include FAIR, but we also have to include CARE in all levels of the open infrastructure that we have to plan for future.
Thank you. The other theme that I wanted to jump into, because I've seen it come up now in a couple of different ways in the questions, was the question around participation in the creation of the infrastructures. And so this was brought up by some of the questions that were raised by Arley, but I think also both by Devika and Dasapta as well. And it's a lot of the questions I think Dasapta that you got in the chat there sort of center around this theme around you making a lot of use of some of the open source projects and infrastructure, but what's the way in which any contributions and things that are being built locally are being then taken up by the global community. And this ties into these questions around the global versus the local, the questions of equity and participation, and what is often seen as the one-way flow of the tools and the infrastructures that are being produced in places that have resources, and then places that are, that are making use of them are not able to participate equitably in the creation, the shaping, the guiding. And so again, this is, I'll leave that question open because I know that also, even though Kaitlin spoke to it in the big picture way, but I think the three of you spoke of it with specific experiences in mind. So I'd love to hear more about the participation in the shaping of that infrastructure and shaping of the tools. And with that came some sort of side questions around, this idea about how commercial players can play a role in this or not, as well as what kind of contribution agreements would need to be put in place, or contribution norms rather would need to be put in place. So let me just open that can of worms up and let you jump in around participation in the shaping and creation of the infrastructure, the role and how those contributions are received.
I would say that I think in Latin America, there are a lot of people that would like to contribute more with different projects, but I can feel like a barrier and with the language. It seems like with first languages or some guidelines for some leader that say, okay, you can participate in this way. You can create this part of code that is needed for this local or regional like problem or necessity, and we need this kind of work or this kind of money, and it is very clear, and it is in Spanish or Portuguese, because I think it's not difficult to translate things like that. Yeah, it's just as even the translators are very have potential now. So with those kind of things, I would say like a clear leadership, and with things or initiatives being described in Spanish and Portuguese, at least for Latin American context, would help a lot. And I think commercial entities should contribute more, as I have said in my contribution, either with money or work.
Dasapta, do you want to comment as well?
Yeah, so about the participation in to the open source or open infrastructure, I think that cannot be happening if the government still relies highly into those commercial publisher or commercial, what do you call it, for commercial rankings, right? So most of the system that we take into the academic system here in Indonesia is mostly based on commercial entities. So as long as we still rely on that in measuring our performance, I cannot think of how the government could support it, whether you know that the OJS is mostly used by the journals in Indonesia, but I I cannot think that could happen. It's very hard, Juan, to talk to the government to support this kind of activities. To mention another initiative is ORCID, right? ORCID has approached the government. They offer the easy connectivity about data and how the government or the university can get the data of the staff. You know what I mean. The ORCID is gather up the data of the academic paper published by the staff, and then they push the data to the government, Indonesia government or universities. They offer those kind of service, but still the government and in my case is my university don't want to spend their money on contributing to them. Instead of they still have a close relationship to Scopus database and Web of Science database. Yeah, that's I think it's our weakness in Indonesia to support it.
I think it raises what will probably be the third sort of theme of questions that I'm pulling together here, but around the issues around prestige, I think was brought up by you, by Arley, and by Devika as well. So, but before I do that, I know that Kaitlin was having a bit of an exchange around based on a question by Katrina around the role of commercial players to participate as actors. So I just want to give you a chance to also comment on that as well, Kaitlin, before we move on to what will probably be our last question.
Thank you. I do think that, and I know there have been a couple of questions here about how service providers and also commercial entities can engage. As we've moved forward with our research, which I know, Juan, you're a part of as well, you know, completely taking out all for-profit service providers from, say, operating a library institution, it in many cases is just, it's complicated, right? And so understanding what those decisions are and what those trade-offs are, and where some alignment on how organizations and entities can contribute genuinely, what the trade-offs are, what the rules of engagement are. I think there's a lot of room for creativity and development there. We're starting to explore what that could look like. And I know I mentioned in the chat, I think when it comes to some of the elements around transparency, around pricing and operations, reciprocity, are they giving back? In what sort of ways? How can they be good actors in the space? And also, what happens if someone or one of the parties steps out of line? If you think of some of the ways in which big businesses operate, if you're operating at a certain scale, it's not always because all of your partners are trusted friends of the operation, but there are ways in which to direct engagement. And so I'm keen to continue to explore that. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there, but also with some real concerns and conversations we need to have around what the trade-offs are for data about certain behaviors, what sort of ownership and who has access to that information, and also what happens when someone maybe does something that breaches that trust, and what does that mean for the project and their involvement. But I think that there's some great questions there, and I'm happy to take that up offline too.
That's great. We do think we're up to our half hour, and I just want to be mindful of all the people that are staying up late, including those of you on the panel. But also, I know we have attendees also joining, and so I want to be mindful of the time. So let me just finish it here. I think the conversation can continue asynchronously or synchronously on the Slack, on Twitter on the hashtag. I know that there was some comments that I wasn't quite following as we were going on Twitter as well about the panel. But let me just say thank you very much to all four of you for these really sort of engaging presentations that have given us
a pretty broad perspectives and ways of thinking about the challenges and opportunities with open infrastructures. Also just thank the rest of the organizing committee and all of the coordination and technical bits that have been made this possible. And I think that everything has gone off smoothly thanks to the work of everyone on the OASPA team and on with the Copyright Clearance Center helping us coordinate with no technical glitches whatsoever. So it's always a pleasure to see that. And thank you all for taking the time and joining us today. We will continue to see you the next after half-hour break. There is another panel on the futures of open research. So I hope to see you all, or as many of you there as possible. Thanks again, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you, Juan.
Thank you.